Have you ever heard the phrase Black Irish? And if you have, do you actually know where it comes from? Because most people who use it have never stopped to question whether the explanation they learned was real. Somewhere on the western edge of Ireland, there is a face that does not follow the rules history laid out for it. Jet black hair, skin so pale it seems to absorb the light, eyes carrying the cold gray-green of Atlantic water before a storm. For centuries, people reached for the nearest comfortable explanation: Spanish sailors, Viking blood, Norman knights, who stayed too long. The story spread not because they contained evidence, but because they gave the mystery a human shape and a date on a calendar. Modern genetics went somewhere those stories could never follow, into ancient skeletons, into DNA older than kingdoms. And what scientists found was not a corrected migration map. It was the survival record of an ancient human system that should have been erased thousands of years ago, but was not. This is not a story about hair color. It is a story about extinction pressure, about which traits vanish completely and which ones survive hidden beneath newer identities for thousands of years. And before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell us where in the world you are watching from. Boston, Dublin, Melbourne, Cape Town, somewhere that has never had a single connection to Ireland in its entire history. Tell us where you are, and tell us whether you already believed the Spanish Armada story, because what the bones of Bronze Age Ireland revealed is about to change everything. The most famous explanation arrived with a catastrophic storm, and it arrived with exactly the kind of dramatic detail that makes myths almost impossible to kill. In 1588, the Spanish Armada, the most powerful naval fleet of its age, was torn apart by weather systems that no admiral could have planned around. Ships shattered against rocks, sailors drowned in water cold enough to kill within minutes. And survivors, dark-haired and visibly different from the pale coastal populations they stumbled into, dragged themselves ashore along the Irish coastline and into local memory. The story practically assembled itself. They stayed, they married, they had children who inherited those darker features, and somewhere in those bloodlines, people said, the Black Irish were born. It is the kind of explanation humans love most deeply because it is concrete, it is romantic, and it happened on a specific date that any historian could point to on a map. A mystery with a visible, traceable beginning. But genetics does not respond to emotionally satisfying narratives. Genes obey mathematics, and mathematically, the Armada theory was never viable. A few hundred survivors scattered across hundreds of miles of coastline cannot permanently shift the appearance of a regional population already numbering in the millions. The scale was never there. Modern DNA studies searched for the Spanish signal anyway and found almost nothing measurable. The Viking theory held up longer because at least part of it was genuinely real. Norse raiders transformed Ireland between the 9th and 11th centuries, founded cities, built trade networks, and left behind measurable Scandinavian Y chromosome signatures, still visible in Eastern Irish populations today. But geography dismantled that theory too. The Black Irish appearance concentrated not in Viking urban centers along the eastern coast, but deep in the Atlantic West, in Kerry and Cork and Galway, in places later migrations had barely touched. And eventually, researchers had no choice but to follow the evidence somewhere much older and much stranger than any medieval invasion story. Around 2500 BC, Ireland already held thriving communities descended from early Mediterranean farmers who had spread slowly northward along Europe's Atlantic coastline across thousands of years of quiet, patient movement. These were not primitive people. They built stone circles and passage tombs aligned to celestial events. They organized complex ritual landscapes. They raised animals and worked agricultural systems sophisticated enough to support dense regional populations. And genetically, many of them carried darker pigmentation traits inherited from the ancient farming populations whose ancestry connected southward toward the Mediterranean world. Then the Bell-Beaker people arrived from continental Europe, and what followed was one of the largest demographic catastrophes ever reconstructed through ancient DNA. Across Britain and Ireland, genetic evidence now indicates that within only a few centuries, most of the existing Neolithic genetic structure simply disappeared. Not gradually through cultural assimilation, not peacefully through intermarriage across stable generations, but rapidly enough that researchers now describe it as near-total population replacement, driven by some combination of migration, displacement, and demographic collapse that the archaeological record cannot fully explain. On Rathlin Island off the Irish coast, researchers excavated Bronze Age skeletons buried roughly 4,000 years ago. When those bones were sequenced, they carried the R1b, L21 paternal lineage, still dominant among Irish men today. Those skeletons were not distant, unrelated ancestors. They were the direct biological forebears of modern Ireland, but the replacement was incomplete in ways that mattered enormously. Dark pigmentation alleles survived inside maternal lineages and isolated Atlantic communities that the replacement wave never fully reached. What emerged was not a single unified population. It was a layered human survival system. Ancient hunter-gatherer ancestry, Mediterranean farming ancestry, and steppe-derived Bronze Age ancestry, all compressed together, all competing biologically inside the same living people. The fathers tell one version of Ireland's history, the mothers tell a different one entirely, and in Ireland, those two stories diverge in ways that change everything. Y chromosomes pass from father to son like biological surnames written in DNA. They record conquest, replacement, and the movement of dominant male lineages across conquered territory. But mitochondrial DNA moves differently. It passes from mother to child almost unchanged across thousands of years of transmission, accumulating mutations so slowly that maternal lineages can be traced back to populations that predate recorded history by millennia. When researchers examined Irish mitochondrial DNA, what they found beneath the Bronze Age replacement event was ancient maternal continuity that had survived almost intact. Some Irish maternal lineages connect directly to the first humans who reached the island after the glaciers retreated more than 7,000 years ago. Women who hunted along Atlantic coastlines in a world that had barely recovered from the last ice age. Women carrying survival systems already shaped by tens of thousands of years of prehistoric European experience. And their DNA is not metaphorically present in modern Ireland. It is literally there, sequenceable, measurable, and unmistakable. More striking still, many of these ancient maternal lineages show their closest modern affinities not to Britain but to Atlantic and Mediterranean coastal populations stretching toward Iberia and western France. Not because of any medieval shipwreck, but because Atlantic maritime movement existed thousands of years before nations or written languages or any story anyone thought to record, the Atlantic was never a barrier for prehistoric humans. It functioned more like a biological corridor along which entire families carried their genetics northward across generations. And some of those lineages preserved darker pigmentation systems that kept black hair alive, even as lighter Bronze Age traits spread across the island. Ireland's fathers transformed the population. Ireland's mothers preserved what came before it. If you want to see the Black Irish face today, you go west. Kerry, Cork, Galway. Places where Atlantic wind moves across stone walls older than most countries, and where families worked the same valleys for more generations than anyone bothered to document. The Irish DNA Atlas Project, led by researchers from the Royal College of Surgeons and Trinity College Dublin, discovered that Ireland is not the genetically uniform population outsiders often assume it to be. The island fractures into distinct ancestral clusters, and the oldest, most continuous clusters concentrate overwhelmingly in the Atlantic West. While Eastern Ireland absorbed stronger Viking demographic influence through centuries of coastal settlement and urban trade, Western Ireland remained unusually insulated from later waves of outside genetic replacement. The Viking signal weakens measurably as you move inland and westward. The Bronze Age Atlantic signal strengthens in its place. Isolation operates on populations mathematically rather than symbolically. Scientists describe this process through the concept of the founder effect. When relatively small populations remain cut off from outside genetic flow across enough generations, traits that once appeared rarely begin stabilizing. They amplify across communities rather than averaging out through contact with larger outside populations. Eventually, entire regional communities carry biological combinations that once existed only in scattered individuals. This is exactly what happened across Western Ireland. The unusual convergence of black hair, pale skin, and light eyes found the precise environmental conditions it needed to persist and concentrate across centuries. Geography protected the combination. Cultural continuity reinforced it. Tight kinship networks across generation after generation preserved it. And over enough time, the Atlantic west of Ireland became something that has almost no equivalent anywhere else in Europe. A living biological archive of prehistoric Atlantic ancestry, still readable in modern human faces. Then there is the gene that made Ireland globally recognizable in the first place. MC1R, the pigmentation system most strongly associated with red hair. Ireland carries some of the highest concentrations of MC1R variants anywhere on Earth, which is why red hair appears among the Irish at rates dramatically above the global average. The biology behind it is well established. Specific MC1R mutations weaken the production of eumelanin, the pigment responsible for dark hair, and allow pheomelanin, the pigment responsible for red and golden tones, to dominate instead. But here is the complication that the standard explanation never fully addresses. Carrying an MC1R variant does not guarantee red hair in any individual. Pigmentation is not a single binary switch. It is an ongoing biological conflict between competing systems inherited from different ancestral populations operating simultaneously inside the same genome. MC1R mutations weaken the darker melanin signal without eliminating the underlying production machinery entirely. Other pigmentation systems continue operating beneath them, which means someone can carry red hair variants and still inherit jet black hair if the darker melanin production genes they inherited from other ancestral lines remain dominant enough to override the weakening signal. This is why Irish families sometimes produce siblings who appear to come from entirely different ethnic backgrounds. One child with hair the color of a lit match, another with hair so dark it absorbs light at the edges. Same parents, same ancestry, radically different outcomes, emerging from the same ancient genetic contest, playing out differently in two separate developmental trajectories. And those darker pigmentation alleles are genuinely ancient. Ancient DNA analysis confirms they were already present in Neolithic Ireland, thousands of years before the Bronze Age transformation introduced the lighter traits that now dominate the population. The two systems met, competed, merged incompletely, and never fully resolved. The Black Irish face is the living evidence of a genetic conflict that has been running without a final winner for 4,000 years. Then came a catastrophe recent enough to still exist inside living family memory. Between 1,845 and 1,852, Ireland lost approximately half its total population through starvation, epidemic disease, and mass emigration driven by one of the worst crop failures in European history. Entire villages emptied within a single decade. Bloodlines that had persisted across centuries vanished permanently within a few years. Communities that had maintained their genetic continuity through Bronze Age transformations, Viking settlements, Norman conquests, and plantation colonization were erased faster than any of those earlier pressures had managed. When populations collapse at that speed and scale, evolution does not slow down. It accelerates through a mechanism more brutal than ordinary natural selection: demographic filtering. When millions of individuals disappear from a gene pool simultaneously, the traits carried by the surviving minority become proportionally amplified automatically, not because they were selected for their survival advantages, but simply because the people carrying them happened to survive. Traits once distributed across a wide regional population concentrate suddenly into smaller surviving communities. Western Ireland experienced some of the most devastating losses. But its geographic isolation also meant that the communities surviving afterward remained genetically anchored to older local lineages, rather than being replenished by significant outside migration afterward. Researchers studying hereditary hemochromatosis, sometimes called the Celtic curse, found another layer of this survival history embedded in Irish biology. The mutation causes dangerous iron overload in modern well-fed populations. But under conditions of chronic food scarcity across generations, retaining additional iron may have improved survival margins, enough to spread the variant through populations under repeated famine pressure. Western Ireland carries some of the highest frequencies on Earth. It is a biological record of people who survived conditions that permanently erased entire populations elsewhere. Modern genomics eventually assembled the final picture, and once researchers reconstructed Irish ancestry at continental scale against the broader European record, the answer that emerged was both precise and almost impossible to argue with. Modern Irish populations descend from three ancient ancestral systems that fused thousands of years ago. Western hunter-gatherers who repopulated the island after the Ice Age glaciers retreated. Mediterranean-derived early farmers who carried darker pigmentation alleles northward along Atlantic Europe across millennia of slow coastal movement. And Bronze Age steppe pastoralists whose expansions reshaped the genetic structure of the entire continent. That three-way combination has remained essentially stable across nearly 4,000 years of subsequent history. Few populations anywhere in Europe can claim equivalent continuity. Later arrivals left marks, but not evenly. Viking influence concentrated in eastern coastal cities. Norman signatures appeared in aristocratic eastern lineages. Plantation-era migrations shaped the north. The Atlantic West absorbed almost none of it at the genetic level, even when it absorbed the cultural and political consequences. This is why the Black Irish mystery survived so long without resolution. People assumed that unusual appearances required recent outsiders to explain them, but the truth was almost exactly the opposite. The faces treated as anomalies requiring foreign explanation may actually preserve some of the oldest surviving ancestry on the island, not imported recently, preserved anciently. And once that realization settles into place, something larger begins to shift. Because populations are not fixed biological categories, they are survival systems operating under pressure. They fragment, merge, collapse, and rebuild across time. Traits survive not because they are inherently superior, but because specific environmental conditions allow them to persist long enough to reach the future. The west coast of Ireland became one of those accidental preservation zones, a human archive protected by Atlantic geography and cultural continuity, long enough for ancient genetics to still be visible in living faces today. Somewhere tonight, on the west coast of Ireland, someone with black hair and pale skin is almost certainly walking beneath Atlantic rain, without any awareness that they are carrying one of the oldest surviving genetic continuities in Europe inside their biology. Not Spanish, not Viking, not the product of any foreign influence passing through and leaving its mark. Ancient. Their face is not a genetic accident or an anomaly requiring a medieval explanation. It is the visible outcome of thousands of years of survival pressure operating on the Atlantic edge of the world, preserved by isolation and cultural continuity, and the particular ruthlessness of demographic survival across multiple civilizational collapses. And perhaps that is the thing about human evolution that the Black Irish story reveals most clearly. The systems we assume disappeared are often still present, buried beneath newer identities, hidden beneath the assumptions that modern populations make about their own origins, waiting for science to develop the tools necessary to read them again. Because extinction is rarely as complete as history implies. Sometimes entire populations vanish without survivors. But sometimes, only fragments survive. And sometimes those surviving fragments preserve ancient human worlds inside ordinary modern faces that pass through contemporary life completely unaware of what they are carrying. The myths surrounding the Black Irish persisted for so long because they were emotionally simpler than the real answer. A shipwreck on a specific date feels more manageable than 4,000 years of unbroken genetic continuity. A Viking raid feels more dramatic than ancient maternal lineages refusing to dissolve into the populations that replaced their fathers. But the bones have now been read. And what the DNA reveals is not a mystery in need of a romantic solution. It is persistence. The persistence of prehistoric humanity hiding beneath the surface of modern Ireland, visible in faces that history kept trying to explain away as foreign. The west coast of Ireland was never preserving foreigners accidentally left behind by passing invaders. It was preserving memory, biological memory older than any story Ireland ever told about itself. The memory of hunter-gatherers crossing into a post-Ice Age world. The memory of Mediterranean farmers carrying darker pigmentation northward along Atlantic coastlines across thousands of years of slow generational movement. The memory of Bronze Age collapse and partial survival. Ancient people who absorbed enough demographic pressure to reshape the genetics of an entire island and still left traces inside the populations that replaced them. This is perhaps why the Black Irish face produces that particular quality of recognition when people encounter it. Not the comfortable recognition of something familiar. Something closer to the unsettling recognition of something that should be gone but is not. We recognize when something older is looking back at us, not from museum displays, not from fossil reconstructions, but from living human faces still carrying the survival architecture of world civilization moved past thousands of years ago. The Atlantic West preserved those faces because geography created the precise conditions of isolation that protected ancient genetic combinations from the replacement pressures that reshaped the rest of Europe. The Black Irish were never the product of invasion. They were the survivors underneath the invasions. The oldest continuous genetic layer of Ireland still present in living people after 4,000 years of migrations, famines, collapses, and conquests. The world kept reaching for simpler stories because the real one required a scale of time that human beings find genuinely difficult to hold in their minds. But the bones have now been read. And the ancient system hiding beneath Ireland has finally spoken clearly enough for everyone to hear. If this documentary reached something in you, subscribe to Prehistoric Shadows, where the extinction and survival of humanity are explained through systems under extreme pressure. And before you leave, tell us where in the world you are watching from tonight. Because somewhere out there, someone carrying this exact story in their own biology is watching too.